Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Tonight I bring you more experiences reported by our listeners who've had some, shall we say, downright terrifying ordeals. We will hear from a couple of friends who were camping in a beautiful area when they had a night that they will never forget. In our first account, we hear of an encounter from the Aviemore area of Scotland, a place that is wild and beautiful. Its wind-swept scenery is probably as wild as you can get here in the UK. The creatures seen in the area are also probably the wildest you will see in the UK. I know townfolk can mistake ordinary animals, as they're not used to the usual noises they make or how big they are. And each week now we see videos going up where that wild camper, and I use that term lightly, is terrified by the sound of an owl or a fox or a cow. It happens so often, I question how someone who is used to sleeping wild cannot recognise the noise that is common and often heard. This case is very different. In this event, I think our witness is justified in her terror. I would have been just as scared. Our witness said, "It's only by chance that I found you. BBR came up as a suggestion on YouTube one day, and I'm so glad it did. Listening to your reports has enlightened me. It's educated me and brought me to a place where I'm now in a more comfortable position with my experience. I now realise I'm not alone. My experience was far from a one-off. All the years since it happened, I felt in isolation, feeling there was no one out there to listen to our account, no one to help us make sense of it. I have a need to tell our story, as I want people to realise there is a danger out there, or at least we have to be armed with the knowledge of how to deal with these seemingly impossible creatures. This is what happened to us. I'd invited my friend to stay with me as her husband was working abroad and I was single. We had no ties. The two of us planned and went on adventures whenever we could. It was like being teenagers again, even though we were both in our 40s. We love camping, and especially love camping in Scotland, which is a bit wilder and more challenging. My friend had an idea of doing a whole loop of Scotland, taking in the Isle of Skye too, and coming down the east coast and ending in Northumberland, where she was originally from. We had a fantastic time. It was certainly an adventure, and it was so wild. We nearly lost a tent in a storm-force gale and got all our stuff soaked on at least one occasion. But it was all part of the fun. Nothing fazed us. We got to camp in some really lonely spots where we were the only ones around for miles. And we never once gave any thought to our safety or anything otherworldly. This was especially true on our return leg of the journey. We drove through Aviemore, and what a brilliant, vibrant place it was. The bars and the cafes were buzzing. The place had a wonderful atmosphere. We decided we'd go and find somewhere local to camp and come back later for a walk around with our dogs and enjoy the place. My friend found that just a few minutes away was a really luxurious caravan park with all the mod cons that had provisions for campers too. The thought of a hot shower and comfort was most welcome after some of the Spartan places we'd stayed in on this trip. The site was lovely. We were made to feel very welcome and the facilities were excellent. There was a choice of camping in a large flat camping ground, or they had newly set up U-shaped bays, edged with what I would call Christmas trees as a shelter, large enough to put your car, tent, and then some other things in. We took our dogs for a walk and the scenery was gorgeous. You could see the Cairngorms and the weather was lovely. We were about a week or two into September by then. By the time the tent was set up and we'd walked the dogs, it was getting towards tea time. So we decided to pop back to Aviemore to soak up some of that atmosphere, grab a curry, which we ate in the car, whilst people watching. It was our way of joining in, as our dogs were too naughty to take into a pub or a cafe. It'd been a lovely day and I was so happy. We had a great time, but now it was time to head back home to the tent. We stopped via the bathrooms. Wow, they were heated and spotless. We got washed, got into our night clothes, popped our hoodies on over the top and took the dogs for the final walk of the night. Back into the car, we drove up the track to the camping bays. And as we pulled up, an inner voice said, "Don't get out of the car, sleep in here tonight." This was so conscious of the day I'd had. Why would something so negative pop into my head? Yeah, it was dark, but far cosier and safer than many of the places I'd been staying in the past week. I brushed off this negative thought, which had made me feel sick to the stomach, and I convinced myself I must be overtired or something. My goodness, this was a lesson in always trusting your gut instinct. Each night on the trip, we got into a pattern that once we'd settled the dogs in their beds, we'd sit up chatting for a while and plan the next stage of the journey. Once we'd done this, my friend would read a story from an old book she had brought with her of celebrity ghost stories. It was a guilty pleasure and a bit of a laugh. I turned my torch off and I put the maps away and I let my friend sitting up on her airbed, holding her book in one hand, and she led the story and she had a torch in the other. I settled down and I started listening to the story. It was about Elton John, I think. The time must have been approaching 11 p.m. by then. Can't say for sure. I was enjoying the story when we both heard a noise. The noise sounded like someone or some people walking up the trackway towards the camping bays. At first, I thought it must be a French family who were the only other campers on site that night. They were in the bay about 10 bays away from ours. We always camped as far away as possible from other people, as our dogs had gone nuts at the slightest sound of any fellow campers made. Within a split second, I recognised the sounds were not of voices. It sounded odd, more like a handheld transistor radio. Who on earth would have been playing such a thing out here at this time of night? Within another split second, I realised that the sound was on a loop or repeat. Had someone recorded a sound sequence over and over and was playing it outside in the darkness? Suddenly, every nerve and fibre in my body realised actually this thing was coming for us. My friend realised at exactly the same moment. She turned off her torch and didn't say a word or move a muscle. It is very difficult to describe the sound. It was melodic, not human, but not exactly animal either. But it was as intimidating a noise as you could ever hear. Oh my goodness, I knew. Whoever or whatever was coming up the track was dangerous and unhinged. We sat there frozen, not knowing what to do, not moving a muscle, and barely breathing as this terrifying thing came into our camping bay. I can't find the words to describe how unearthly and horrifying this sound was. This thing walked around the car and came up to the entrance of our tent, and it lingered there for what seemed like an eternity. The sound was emanating a couple of feet above the apex of the tent. Now the apex was 6 foot, making this thing about 8 feet tall. The thing then walked around our tent, came to my side, and stood inches away from my face. There was no smell, no heavy footfalls. I did hear one noise, but I can't tell you if it was a footfall or something being dropped. My emotion at this point was totally primal. This had escalated very quickly. I knew I was prey, and I was totally helpless against whatever this was. There was just a tent wall between me and it, and I prepared to die. I'm not being dramatic. I went beyond fear and became calm almost. I accepted there'd be no fight here. It was going to swipe at the tent and take me out in one hit. This thing was huge. In this calm, I was sad. I would never see my family again. I'd never see where this new relationship with the guy I'd been out with a few times would go. I just sat there, awaiting my fate, listening to this terrifying sound, realising this is how it was going to end for me, in a ridiculous way, in as much as no one would ever know the truth. All my family would know is that we were murdered by a psychopath who attacked 2 women camping in an almost deserted caravan park. No one would ever know that there was more to this story than that. However, by some stroke of luck, this thing had made its point, and it moved away from us. It went diagonally through the trees. I didn't hear the trees disturbed in any way, or this thing brushing through them, but it definitely went in that direction. I listened to the sound disappearing into the distance. I grabbed my BlackBerry phone, had it on 999 ready to dial if it came back. At least the operator would hear what was going on. My friend waited a while and got down into a sleeping bag and said, "It's not coming back." I waited about 2 hours in the same position, afraid that if I moved it would come back. I finally laid down about 2 a.m, still with my thumb on the dial. Thankfully, we had no further disturbances that night. The next morning, we just couldn't believe what we'd gone through and actually got through unscathed. We agreed it was all very odd and we were dealing with something very strange. We asked each other what we thought it was, and we came up with exactly the same impressions. I felt it was a primitive hominid, something akin to a caveman who was an absolute psychotic. I fully expected to leave my tent the next morning and notice we were camped in the middle of a stone circle or on top of a Neolithic barrow or something of that nature. We've done something to arrange this being. If he was not coming to attack us for nothing, what had we done that bothered him so badly? He'd come to kill us. The light from my friend's torch, maybe, a voice, and perhaps the location of our tent had sent this thing into a frenzy. Our calmness had somehow appeased it, thank goodness for it. We packed down the tent, went to pay our fees at the camp shop, and the lady who had welcomed us warmly the day before was in the shop that morning, after us settling our bill and thanking her for the lovely stay. My friend just asked if there were any Neolithic burial chambers or stone circles around. She said she didn't know of any. And when my friend told her that something was stalking our tent overnight, she closed down and became defensive. She was clearly hiding something. This had probably happened before. When we returned home, my friend just couldn't rest. Someone out there must know something, she said. To me, this was so fringe that even the Forteans out there would not believe what happened to us. There was no point in pursuing it. She looked for Neolithic remains on the map, and there was nothing listed. We'd both been convinced that there was a Neolithic connection, something from the caveman era anyhow. On my first night home, I went to bed, and I could hear my friend tapping away on a laptop in her room. About 2 a.m, she knocked on my bedroom door. Wake up, she said. Have you ever heard of the Grey Man of Ben MacDo? Half awake, I was a bit annoyed. Why was she asking me about that book Prince Charles had written? No, she said, no, not the old man of Loch Nagar, the Grey Man of Ben MacDo. I said I had no idea what she was talking about and asked her to open my door and put the light on. She had found there were lots of reports going way back of people camping in the Cairngorms and having odd experiences. There was one she read out that was very similar to ours, but we'd been on a cosy campsite, and these men were halfway up Ben MacDo when they had their terrifying encounters. I was impressed with the detective work, but it made it worse somehow that we were dealing with something completely fantastical, almost mythical. Who'd believe us? However, it was important for our story to be told from a point of, firstly, public safety, and secondly, from a position of people needing to know what's out there. The one thing that made my blood run cold was when my friend said to me, "Funny how the dogs didn't wake up and bark." I think things would have gone very badly if the dogs would have been true to their nature and gone off on a barking spree. But why didn't they hear the loud noise that thing was making? I can't fathom it. But I'm just glad they stayed sleeping and silent. Otherwise, I don't think any of us would be here to share this account. I wish I could convey how frightening this all was. But as I heard on another of your reports, a chap said how these occurrences do not easily translate into words. Something stalked our tent. That's all there is to the story, really. But what was responsible? Was something completely out of the ordinary. There can be no doubt about that. Deb, there's a second part to this story, and it's a hard one to accept. But as you are experienced in the paranormal field, you'll understand the phenomena of unbelievable synchronicities. Let's just say, the caravan park used to be farmland, rented out to the military for their exercises, and my husband had his own experience there in 1978. I thought my experience was enough, but to find out my husband had a very similar experience, well, I just gave up. How much weirdness can one person handle? I'm happy to send you his account if you'd like to hear it. She said, "Thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you do. I can't tell you the comfort I've had from listening to other reports, especially the few which have similarities to mine. To end, I'll just say that I would swear on everything I hold dear that what I have recounted to you is completely true. Recounting my story to you has been cathartic for me. But again, I want people to be careful and respectful of what's out there. We need to be educated on the possibilities of what we can run into when camping, or simply wandering through a park. This is information everybody should know." Thanks, Deb. All the best to you and yours. Now, I asked my friend Chris Huff if he could help me with information in the area, as he's a paranormal investigator who visits and films areas just like this all across the UK. Chris knows his early sites, so he did help me with information on Aviemore and ancient burial sites. He came through and sent the information over to me mid-August 2023, and he said, "Deb, there are 3 circles near Aviemore. One is Aviemore itself. Actually, they're Claver cairns, which are Bronze Age burial cairns, and they're big. Aviemore Stone Circle is in Aviemore. Then there's the Greenwich Circle, a little 2 miles east-northeast of Aviemore. And then there's the Delphos Stones, which are about 4 miles southwest of Aviemore Station." As soon as Chris mentioned Claver cairns, I knew there was another serendipity. I have a number of large hairy creatures, often described as dark red in colour, in the Claver cairns area. In fact, several locals and visitors have described seeing them for at least a number of decades. The reports on Ben Macdhu are probably all connected, as the land never forgets what it was. You can build on it, you can plough it and flatten it with tarmac, but the soul of the land is still there. The essence that it held, the importance, just now they're disrespected, forgotten, and mostly unattended. Serendipity is also at play for Aviemore and Strange Cottage holidays, as they're becoming a bit of a theme here at BBR. It wasn't too long ago we heard from the family who was staying at a holiday cottage in Deeside when they encountered a creature that stalked the cottage and banged on the window. At night, the mother of the family would hear it walking outside on the gravel. She felt she encountered it when she left the cottage to go to the food freezer, which was kept outdoors. She said she knew if she ran at that point she'd be dead. The sheep on the farm acted strangely, and many of the dogs in the area were excitable and refused to be walked. Then I received a report from Jo, who also experienced something strange after visiting Edinburgh Castle with her husband. After setting off in the car for the next leg of their journey, their enjoyable day changed quickly. Jo said, "At some point in the wee hours, we drove through what seemed like an endless forest and discovered that there were millions of toads all climbing over each other on the road. I've never seen so many toads in one place in my life." Anyway, me being all protective of nature, I got out of the car onto this pitch dark road in the middle of nowhere and tried to move the toads away from the tyres. I was fighting a losing battle. Just at that moment, we heard a branch snap in the forest. It sounded like whatever had stepped on the branch was heavy, and my husband shouted, "I don't like the sound of that. Get back in the car now." I must admit, it made me feel very vulnerable being out there alone on this dark road, as we'd not seen any streetlights in hours. I jumped back in the car and we sped away, slaughtering many of the poor amphibians as we did. It never sat well with me, that. I've often wondered what it was, hiding in the darkness of the forest. Have there been any sightings of any wild men up in the wilderness of Aviemore, especially around 1999-2000? I think, whatever it was, had been attracted to the migrating frogs or toads as a source of food. Now, the area itself has a history of strange encounters and mystery finds. It was here that the famous John Rennie footprints were discovered by climbers. The prints were running across a stretch of snow-covered moorland. Each print was 19 inches long by about 14 inches wide, and there must have been all of 7 feet between each stride. There was no differentiation between a left and right foot, and they proceeded in an approximately single line through the snow. In 2005, in the wilder parts of the valley, another wild camper had a night he'll never forget when he stayed at one of the bothies known as the Darth Hotel. This account came in through an Outdoors Magic camping blog, and it happened in August of 2005. The account is written by the witness themselves, and they said, "I had a really spooky experience one Sunday night. I'd been out on the Cairngorms alone. I decided to spend the night in a bothy, which I've never visited before. I reached the bothy after dark and it was empty. I sorted out my thermostat sleeping bag, my bivvy bag, and I read my book for a while with my head torchlight before turning in for the night. I was awoken at 2 a.m. by the noise of loud conversation, which seemed to be coming from outside. I went out and investigated with my head torch, but there was no one out there to be seen. I got back in bed. I was just getting back to sleep when all of a sudden I heard a series of loud scraping noises, as if someone were dragging heavy furniture around the bothy floor. I flicked on my head torch and the room was empty and the noises stopped. My heart was in my mouth at this stage and I felt really creeped out. I just couldn't sleep after that. To my horror, the noises started up again, only louder this time, as if a heavy wooden object were being dragged around next to my ear. And once again, I flicked on my head torch and the noise suddenly stopped. Well, that was it. I sat up all night and made a speedy exit back to the car at first light. I should add that I'm very used to wild camping by myself. I've never experienced any feelings of fear or had any unusual experiences like this before, but I know I won't be returning to that bothy again. Earlier, our first witness said she felt that she'd die that night and no one would know how or why. I don't suppose she thought that maybe she'd just joined the many thousands of missing people who vanish in our woodlands, mountain ranges and valleys here in the UK. Admittedly, some of these missing can be attributed to people becoming lost or planning on never being found. We're so used to this here in the UK, we barely notice when another report comes onto the news or appears in the newspaper. I'm also guilty of this. The next case I'm sharing, I missed completely. It was only when it was shared with me by one of the ladies who visited Abermore that I became aware of it. It would seem the gentleman vanished on a lonely lochside. He'd set off for a hike with friends, and at one point on the walk he didn't feel well, so he went back to his tent. He stabbed his walking poles into the ground. He put his kit and his phone in his tent. He zipped up the inside of the tent, but not the outside, and he'd not been seen since. The mystery of the missing hiker. Now, this happened in May of 2022. Police Scotland issued a fresh appeal over a missing walker after the man vanished in very unusual circumstances. Neil Skinner, 71, from Doncaster, South Yorkshire, was last seen close to Loch Duchard in Argyll and Bute on the 8th of May 2022. Despite extensive searches, no sign of Mr. Skinner had been found. His daughter Kate said, "It's been really difficult. It's a difficult time. And to still have no news and no answers of what happened to him is awful. It's been the most difficult 6 months you can imagine. In some ways, it feels like yesterday. And in other ways, it feels like a lifetime since I saw Dad." Mr. Skinner was last seen camping close to the loch. And Mr. Skinner had been on a walking tour with two friends when he returned to his tent alone as he wasn't feeling well. When his friends returned to the campsite, Mr. Skinner was nowhere to be found, despite all his clothes, walking equipment being in the tent, along with his phone and his wallet. A police search involving helicopters, drones, and diving and mountain rescue teams were also carried out, but Mr. Skinner was never found. He is described as being 5'8", with short white hair and having a white goatee-type beard, and he wears glasses. He was wearing a green jacket and grey walking trousers when he was last seen. His porridge was still steeping outside, and the place was untouched. They've had sonar searching for a body through the waterways. The canine dogs are out searching. The whole area has been searched on foot, but there's no trace of him. If he wandered off and had an accident or died, surely they'd have found his clothes, or they'd have seen signs of carrion birds circling. But there's nothing like that been seen, and the friends were back within a few hours. He was an experienced hiker and he wouldn't have wandered off without his phone and kit. Now, this case is a little like the mystery vanishing of a woman in Moncton, Scotland, who police say left her car when it broke down and was killed and scavenged by badgers. In a horrible story from over the Christmas period of 2022, a woman has reportedly been found dead and partially eaten by wildlife after a car broke down on December 18. The 55-year-old is thought to have wandered from a car after it broke down on a country road near Moncton in Ayrshire, Scotland. Now, the AA Recovery Service was unable to find her at the time, and a missing persons report was filed. However, now the body has been found and appears to have been mauled by a badger or perhaps a fox, according to the authorities. The victim is thought to have been from Airdrie, a town in North Lanarkshire. A source told the Daily Record that the woman had phoned the breakdown service, but rather than waiting with the vehicle, she got out and walked away, cutting through the fields, before, sadly, passing away sometime later. Police Scotland confirmed that there was a call-out at around 11:20 p.m. on Saturday, December 18th, and the police subsequently found her abandoned Citroën by the side of the road. They went on to confirm that after officers failed to locate the driver, they opened an inquiry. Then, around 4:55 p.m. on Sunday, December the 19th, after searching for the missing 55-year-old woman, a body was found in a field, approximately 1 mile away from the car. While the cause of death is not yet known, it is not currently being treated as suspicious, and the body is waiting a full coroner's report. Now, call me a conspiracy theorist if you want, but the whole events listed here just do not make sense. We're taught, as soon as we learn to drive, to stay inside the vehicle if it's safe to do so, and alert the authorities. So, we're meant to believe that this lady did the complete opposite, in fact. It was not a howling gale or temperatures below freezing. In fact, it was about 8 degrees, and she would have been quite comfortable in the car. She didn't walk towards a well-lit town a short walk away along a country road, passing a possible vehicle, but instead set off on a short mile walk into dark fields, no lights, and was suddenly overcome with a mystery illness and then eaten by local wildlife. Now, my good friend and co-host Deborah Singleton has researched this case extensively over the last year, and she cannot trace the lady's name or any other information on the case, and no coroner's report has ever been made to this date. Very strange indeed. I think tonight's reports may give many of you just the excuse you need not to wild camp on lonely mountain ranges or in the wild open moors. Understandable. You're much safer from harm tucked up at home. Shut your doors, pull the curtains, and settle in for a comfortable night. It's not like you'll experience anything in your own home, as you're completely safe from harm there. Are you, though? As many of you know, I deal with chronic pain, and there's no let up to it, and it's there constantly, and it ebbs away, and just ebbs away at you at times. I can honestly say, once or twice, I prayed to die, rather than endure another moment of nerve torture. Pain can trap you in your body, take your mind to places it's never visited before. There are also times when, if offered, I would assign that Faustian deal if presented in the late hours of night. Not for some worldly or material benefit, such as knowledge or power or riches, just for release, even for a few moments of pain-free living. Just the chance to sleep. I think our next witness has a good understanding of that. She said, "It was back in the winter of 1992-93 when this experience happened. I'd been married for about 3 years, and my husband worked at a local theatre, so he came home around midnight. We lived in a village. The house had a huge long garden with trees and bushes around it, and the street lights were few and far between. The nights drew in early, and this one night was quite foggy. I'd been suffering from a chronic medical condition for some time. It left me in constant and sometimes terrible pain, and often I felt a breaking point with it. My husband had been reading Anne Rice's supernatural novels and had described to me the plot line in one of them, where the main character's mother was dying, and he'd made her into a vampire to save her. The pain was gone, and she was radiantly well again. This night, I was lying on the sofa in pain, and I thought about that novel. I wished so hard that someone would do that for me, just make me well again. It was worth almost any price to be pain-free. At 5 o'clock, when it was fully dark, I got up and went to the kitchen to feed the cats, but I stopped short as I walked in. I instinctively knew there was something very wrong, and the source of it was outside the back door of my home. Now, before I go any further, I must tell you that I am unafraid of the dark, both inside and outside. Due to my husband's work, I was very accustomed to spending long periods of time alone. It didn't bother me in the least. This was something totally different. I'd never experienced dread like it before. For a few moments, I told myself that I'd been thinking about that stupid book and it had gotten into my head because I was feeling sad about the pain. So it should be nothing to worry about. I forced myself to go back into the kitchen and I put the cat food in the dishes, but I couldn't keep my eyes off the back door. It was a solid door, securely bolted, but there was something out there beyond it, and I could feel it. It was willing me to unlock and open that door. I'm aware that sounds mad, but it's completely true. I called the cats, and they came willingly from wherever they'd been sleeping in the house. They were plainly hungry, but they stopped at the door of the kitchen and looked towards the back door and wouldn't go any further. And that's when I got really frightened. The cats could sense it too, and that made it real for me. I made myself go, get the bowls, and brought them out into the hallway. As soon as I set them down there, they ate with no trouble. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, huddled on the sofa, with the cats beside me. They wouldn't go anywhere near the kitchen, which is unheard of for them, and neither did I. I could feel the presence of something at the back of the house, and the presence of its will, trying to get me to come to the back door and open it. At last I heard the key in the front door, and my husband was back. He called out to me as he came in, and he went to put the kettle in the kitchen. And then I heard him stop abruptly. He came out of the kitchen and came quickly into the living room. He said, "There's a horrible atmosphere at the back of the house. It felt awful," and he asked me if anything was wrong. I told him what had happened, and he didn't disbelieve me. He could feel it for himself. When we got up the next morning, the presence was gone, and the cats were at ease again. The next night, the same thing happened. The presence was there, but I was ready for it, and mentally making it very clear that it was unwelcome and to go away, and I would not be opening the door. It went, and it never returned. I felt that I'd attracted something very bad to the house. It could enter if I let it, because it couldn't come in unless I invited it. Thankfully, I had the strength not to do so. No one but myself and my now ex-husband ever knew of it. We never told anyone else, but sometimes we would talk about it afterwards. It may have been a thought form that was created and fueled by my pain and the wish to be free of it, or it may have been a supernatural creature attracted by some kind of mental beacon I put out. Whatever it was, it had no good intentions. Reading our witness's email made me think of the old adage not to invite anything into your home, almost like the vampires of old. Some beings, it is said, can only enter if you invite them in. As I said earlier, I know just how bad living with constant pain can be, and the hope it will just stop, even for an hour. I've worked with many people over the years who've had reached out in a moment of rage or sadness, grief or pain, and then have lived with an attachment from then on. I have something that will sit by the side of my bed, and his very presence wakes me up. The doctors have always told me it was my pain, and that him was just psychosomatic. They've given me so many meds to cure it, it never went away. But I had this visitor as a child. In fact, he's always been around somewhere. And I was 39 when I had my accident. As a kid, they'd say it was me playing up or me being dramatic, but he's very real and he scares me witless at times, and at others, he makes me rage. One night last year in 2022, before I moved home, I was sound asleep. Mark was asleep next to me. Roy was lying in between us. I usually wake up screaming and fighting if he's around, and it happens so often that Mark just places his hand on me now and it stops. And he can do it without fully waking up. He's become so used to it. This night was different. Roy woke him up by snarling and whining really low, and he positioned himself in front of me. Mark said for about 20 minutes he was trying to get Roy to settle, but he was fixated on the bedroom door. He said I was sound asleep all through this, but about 20 minutes in, I suddenly shot up in bed, and at that, Roy lunged at my side. He lunged at the side of my bed until he got to the bedroom door. He moved something away from me, and it hasn't happened since that night. How can it be my pain if my dog knew it was going to happen? I should add, up to this point, he was still acting like a puppy. He didn't even cock his leg to pee. That night is the only time I've seen him react like this. I think he knew I was in danger, and his reaction was a warning to whatever was outside that door. Just like our witness's cats knew not to go into the kitchen that night. Animals have an amazing way of picking up on things that us humans cannot see with the naked eye. Next week, I will be sharing the account of one man who had experiences with good and bad throughout his life. He too had an experience where his dog acted strangely in a place he knew well. He then began to experience strange activity at home, and he was convinced something followed him home that night and started to appear around his property. Until then, look after yourselves and set strong boundaries. I'll be back next week at the same time, and if you wish to hear more experiences like this before they're released, pop across to my Patreon site or check out our website and YouTube memberships. You'll find a link in the description below. Thank you to all our witnesses who have shared with us, and thank you to everybody that's tuned in tonight. Good night, everyone.